Well, it's Sunday morning again. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that you've got your cup of coffee or tea and are ready to listen to Timothy's walking us through this week's happenings in the Japanese politics. And our topics today are the same as last week's because there are new developments there. But Timothy has the intention to introduce a new one at the end of the room. So last week there was a request or there was a question about some explanation on how the Japanese political system works. So today Timothy is going to begin with it, and of course it will be just the first time. We'll see how it goes, and just like last time, please feel free to ask questions on the way. Timothy is going to give you time, and if you're willing to talk with him, share your opinion or your ideas and questions, please raise your hand and let us know that you would like to join the speakers. Thank you very much. Timothy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Maya. Good morning, everybody. Last week we had a really great audience. 140 people signed up. Not all of them stuck through the entire time, but we very much appreciate people having interest and also raising questions and providing comment. So, as is our usual scenario, I will talk about 5 issues. I've got 5 issues identified that I'm going to talk about. And after each one, I'm going to open the room for questions or comments. Some people, they can't stick around for the entire presentation. But let's try and keep the comments limited to the topic at hand. And then when we finish up at the end of my 5 points, then we'll open the room, and if there are other issues that you'd like to talk about, let's go ahead and address those. But if you have any inclination to do so, go ahead and raise your hand, and Maya will bring you into the room so that when the timing is right, you can just weigh in really quickly. I'd like to move through this really briskly. We have an hour for this room. We went almost 2 hours last time. I'm comfortable with that. I'm not bookend. So as long as people are getting some value out of this and we're generating engagement, I'm good to go with that. So first of all, let me start off with the appointment of a new ambassador to Tokyo. So Tokyo has been without an ambassador for more than a year. Our former ambassador was Bill Haggerty, appointed by Trump. It took Trump about 8 months to identify Bill Haggerty as his candidate for ambassador, and then it took another 3 months for it to go through congressional approval. It's required to be approved by the Senate. So currently, Mr. Joe Biden, President of the United States, nominated Rahm Emanuel, who was the mayor of Chicago. He was the chief cabinet secretary. It's not called chief cabinet secretary. It's what's he called in the United States? But like the chief of staff for Obama. And so that's why he and Joe Biden are so close and have a lot of ties. He's been appointed, so the first thing that has to happen is it has to go through Senate approval, and the Senate is evenly divided, with Kamala Harris holding the deciding vote. So we can imagine that, although it is likely to be controversial, it'll probably be approved, and we can expect the ambassador to be here probably August or September. A lot is left to be seen, but if you don't know much about Rahm Emanuel, there's a lot out on him. There's a lot of positive news, negative news. People who are old Japan hands are predisposed to be somewhat on the wait and see side, maybe on the negative side, because they want somebody who's got good Japan experience, and Ron Emanuel doesn't have that. He's really strong in American politics, obviously. He carries a lot of weight, and he has probably the most important characteristic for an ambassador, and that is a very close relationship with the President of the United States. It's nice to have area expertise, but it's not always the way that it happens. He's from a rough and tumble world. He comes from an excellent family. His two other brothers are renowned in their own different professions. One is a doctor, and he's highly regarded in certain circles. But since he comes from that world, some of it is not so applicable to how business is done, or how lobbying is done, or how you get your way done here in Japan. So there might be a bit of a learning curve. He will rely heavily on his number two. And if you didn't know this, so when Bill Hagerty left, he left to run for the Senate. He didn't stay his whole term. He was here for a little bit more than a year, and then through some dynamics that are a little bit complicated, he decided that he was going to run for a Senate seat from his home state of Tennessee, and he left the post. So the number two, Joe Young, stepped up to be chargé, and chargé is ambassador without portfolio. So you haven't been appointed as an ambassador. You are number two, and whenever the ambassador leaves the country, you become chargé. You're essentially the ambassador until the ambassador comes back. So Joe Young has done a great job, a polished professional, very straightforward Japan hand, well known and liked. With the appointment of, or with the nomination of Ron Emanuel, Joe Young has also received his orders, I guess, that his tour of duty will come to an end. And his number two replacement will be a fellow by the name of Ray Green. And Ray Green is the director of the American Institute in Taiwan. Normally, that would be an ambassadorial position, but the United States follows a one-China policy, and it would be too inflammatory for the United States to establish an embassy in Taiwan. So there's no embassy in Taiwan. Instead, it's called the American Institute. And the fellow who is running that is a fellow by the name of Ray Green. And he will be coming over, probably before the ambassador comes, to transition from Joe Young, set things in order, and get ready for Biden's appointee. So you can anticipate that there will start to be a lot more activity going on from the American embassy, and with the appointment of an ambassador, a lot of things that haven't happened are likely to happen. Plus, Biden is really focused on a couple of the cooperations that he and Suga talked about in terms of energy, in terms of the environment, in terms of semiconductors, that sort of thing. So I think it's pretty exciting. Ron Emanuel will get a fair shake and probably 100 days of people not criticizing what he's doing. But we're all very hopeful, glad that an ambassador will be appointed, and really looking forward to that sort of thing. Just as a side note, many people don't know this, but the Central Intelligence Agency has always got a finger in the diplomatic corps. So the Central Intelligence Agency cannot do any operations inside the United States. That's their mandate. They're not one of the biggest intelligence agencies run by the United States. There are several. Some of them are competing with each other. But there's always a station chief assigned to one of the embassies, or to each embassy. And they're usually in the highest positions, could be number one, maybe number two or number three, but usually in that area, because that's that's part of the role of an embassy, is intelligence gathering and projecting American power and getting what the United States wants out of different relationships. So it's kind of left to be seen, and it's not usually talked about. People don't come with that on their resume, but you can look at the tea leaves and see how that's distributed. So it's just an interesting insight that people frequently ask me about. I'd like to close up Ron Emanuel and the appointment of the new ambassador and open the room for any questions. And if not, then I'm going to move on to my second point, which is vaccines and vaccine policy. Okay, let's move on to vaccines. So there's been a lot of movement this last week with vaccines, and a couple of good news, bad news. They found these storehouse vaccines, and that upset people that less than 2% of the population has been vaccinated, and then they find 2 million doses, and my God, what's going on here? And people didn't know about it. There's just a lot of stuff going on. It's just one of those things. What the country is going through is difficult under any circumstances. South Korea is having a similar issue, and they're a well-organized society and well-administered government, just like Japan is. They are also having problems. Excuse me. The president of South Korea is visiting with Joe Biden next week, and they're switching the agenda around, not to talk about security as a primary issue, but to talk about vaccines, vaccine policy, because it is very difficult. So although we like to criticize the Japanese because they're slow and they don't know how to do it, and how come among all of the G7 they are the lowest in inoculating their population, I think you're beginning to see traction being generated. They started Monday of this last week with the rollout for the 65 and older. And that's 29% of the Japanese population is 65 years and older. So it's an enormous number of people. Kono Taro was so sick of waiting for the administration in the municipalities and in the various prefectures that he received authorization to use the self-defense forces in renting big public arenas and stadiums for mass inoculation. And it's a clever trick because you have lots of medics who can make the injections. They're not under the strict rules as the medical profession insists in injecting people, which was one of the bottlenecks. So there were, just a couple of bottlenecks that you just kind of shake your head when you think about that actually logistically has prevented a rollout. First the syringes, they could only use a 4-shot syringe when there were 5 shots in the vials, so they had to fix that problem. And the nurses, you've got to have the nurse can apply the injection, but a doctor needs to be within 5 feet, and just things like that. And just the well-known approval process. The Japanese can be complete strict sticklers for rules and regulations. I mean, it's just one of the salient aspects of Japanese government. Follow the book and apply the regulations as they are there, and don't take responsibility and don't get blamed. So there's still a lot of fight going on there. And the interesting thing that is, over the last 2 weeks, variants have come up. So everybody is familiar with what's going on in India and how terrifying that is. But the variants here in Japan also are starting to bloom. And in Osaka and Hyogo, 70% of the new cases are of variants. And the variants are sometimes not susceptible to the current vaccine. So there's a lot of fear going on there. And when they announced the new rollout, I mean, who didn't see this coming? So the Prime Minister said we're going to have a state of emergency. it's going to fall within Golden Week, and then right after Golden Week we will release it. And just before Golden Week was over, he extended it. And we knew that would happen because just a 2-week state of emergency is not going to do anything. It was designed just to keep people at home during Golden Week. A lot of people actually followed that. The roads were clear. People didn't go visit their ancestral homes. They didn't go to the beaches that much. But you will see a huge uptick because that is just expected. So it was inevitable that he was going to extend it until the end of the month. And it might be extended again. In the backdrop of that is the Olympics and the vaccine rollout and that sort of thing. So he is fighting a bit of a rearguard action. No good news has come out of this that he can hang his hat on. He did launch the digital agency. That'll be my next topic. But just as far as vaccines are concerned, I hope this is a nice tee up for you. It incorporates some of the things that you've heard that you know about. I'd like to close this portion, open the room for any questions or comments. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate that. So let's talk about one of the things that did happen that was really positive for the Prime Minister, and that was the passage of the digital agency. Now, if you remember last week, I predicted that it would sail through this month, probably within the next week or so, and that's exactly what happened. So probably the members of the Parliament are listening in on Clubhouse and taking their cues as they should. So the digital agency, it passed through the lower house. It went to the upper house. They found spelling errors and syntactical mistakes. And so they printed it out and read the entire 6 laws manually by word. I guess it's manually anyway. But it's funny that it's the digital agency, and they had to do it in such an analog way. That period of our life of Japanese relying on the analog, I think is quickly eclipsing us. And with the launch of the digital agency, I just can't stress how big a deal this is. The Japanese have been so far behind. We all shake our heads when we go to the bank, when we're applying for a cell phone, when we go to the ward office or for the city office. It is just, please write your name, and then on the second page, please write your name, and on the third page, please write your name and your address. And the Japanese themselves are embarrassed by this. I mean, one of the chief motivators of anything to happen in Japan is gaiatsu, the foreign pressure. And this gaiatsu is coming to the fore with regard to digitization of Japanese society in a massive way. So excuse me. I think the digital agency, it will take off pretty quickly. You'll see movement on Hanko and on the My Card system, My Number system. But lots of things are going on in the background related to the digital agency that will, in 2 or 3 years, I predict that is now, and how we have cryptocurrency, and nobody's using cash anymore, and this and that is so much more easy and different. That's what's going to happen. They have put so much money and intuition into this digital agency that I'm very hopeful that the change will. And what they want to do is they want to hopscotch. They want to, admit that they were slow on 5G, and that they are going to really focus on 6G. With the United States, they've committed to $4.5 billion in that regard only, 6G. So they're going to hammer that. The United States and Japan, in cooperation, are going to set up research institutions and device manufacturers and protocols. That's a lot of money, and they're going to do that in an integrated way. with 5G, it's only in rollout now, but the Japanese aren't, they don't have products related to it. The Chinese have about 50% of that market. The South Koreans have another 40%, and everything else is distributed among a lot of the other players, the United States and Japan being minor players, and they want to shift that. 5G isn't completely rolled out. It's not even available throughout the city of Tokyo. But when it is, the next reiteration of that will be 6G, and I can't even begin to imagine the difference between 4G and then 5G, and then what 6G is going to be like. But anyway, they're putting a lot of energy, a lot of effort into that. There's a lot of other things that are going on in the background with regard to the digital agency. Besides that, semiconductors, the United States and Japan have formed a different coalition, and it was a topic of conversation between Biden and Suga, and the availability of rare earth materials, rare earth minerals. So you might not know this, but China was the biggest producer of rare earth materials and minerals. And these are used in new products, new materials, electric cars, a lot of the electronics. And China had the lock on that market. And they began to boycott Japan in 2020. And so that it's just one of those things. It's like the precursor to other trade disputes coming out. You don't do it our way, and we're going to hit you, with different things just to let you know that it stings when you displease us. And they did that with rare earth materials. So the United States and Japan have decided to ramp that up and to close off any reliance on the Chinese for rare earth. And the importance of rare earth is only becoming more and more important with electric cars and the digital agency and semiconductors and that sort of thing. So there's a lot going on in this area. It's something to watch. It'll be quiet for a little bit. The law, although the law was passed, it doesn't go in, the digital agency will not be launched until September or October. And then things will start taking off. They've rented the building that Yahoo is in. They've rented 3 floors there. And so things will really start taking off. Once the agency is up and running, it'll take, growing pains. It'll take them a year to figure out what each other's names are. And they'll work on my number. They'll work on the Hankos. They'll work on faxes. They'll work on those things that are kind of low-hanging fruit and develop the personnel to help them manage that agency, which includes sending soldiers to each of the ministries and dictating to them how they're going to integrate their data, how they're going to share data, how they're going to have email access, and that sort of thing. That's going to be maybe a 4-year, 5-year project. But I think give them 3 years or 4 years, and you'll be able to see some real significant progress there. Anyway, that's my prediction. I'd like to close up digital agency and open the room for any questions or comments. Thank you. You guys are outstanding. So we'll zip through this.
Timothy, sorry, we've got
Sure.
a question. Could you please?
Okay.
Just a moment.
Apologies, guys. Thank you very much, Maya and Timothy. This is Asa Questenberry, founder of Dronex here in Osaka. Just a quick question regarding crypto and Gaiatsu. I know you mentioned that with the digital agency, we would see probably an increase in crypto tokens here in Japan. Do you predict, in your own opinion, that this would be the allowance of a general wide variety of crypto tokens, or would Japan take approach similar to China in creating a digital yen?
Great question. Great question. So, like with the cloud, so the Japanese were really, they knew that they needed to have a better way of having internet services and search functions and not rely on Google for that, because data is being collected, analytics were being applied, and the Japanese felt that they were being manipulated by a foreign company when they're giving them that much access to data. So they thought, let's come up with something that's replicable, that's better maybe, and they kind of threw their hands up and gave up on that. Similar to that, with cryptocurrency, it's still not a sure deal. It's still not fixed. But the proclivity of the Japanese is to have something that the Bank of Japan knows that this is something that is not only inevitable, but also with COVID, just the handling of paper and coins. And you've seen it in supermarkets and in 7-Elevens now, where even in the cash register, you're handling it all by yourself. The person behind the counter is not touching coins. So this is it's like Betamax. It's a short period where it's a kind of a transition, but this will definitely come up. And you've got to learn from the best, and I don't think that the Japanese are close to being the best. So I think the technologies that are being developed by some of the crypto companies now will probably be components of a new system. But the expertise in the technology doesn't reside here in the in Japan. It's there are players from all over the world, from Switzerland and from America, from Israel, on these issues. And in fact, Bitcoin, was developed here. The fellow who founded it lives in near Shibuya. So the likelihood of the Japanese creating something that's uniquely Japanese for a nationwide rollout is very low. They'll probably adopt something, maybe buy the technology, buy the existing Bitcoins, absorb that, and then change it somehow over time so that it's easy to use and it's got features that appeal to the Japanese.
Thank you very much, Timothy. I appreciate it. This is Asa. I'm done talking.
Thanks. Please continue to join in, and on the crypto issues, please weigh in. This is an issue that will continue to come up. It's been in the papers these last 2 weeks anyway. Thanks, Asa. So anybody else? I'll move on to number 4, which is a little bit of a talk about the Prime Minister, and it's a little bit lengthy. I've got a couple bullet points to talk about, but if you're good with that, then I'll just...
Let's go. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that swift kick. So let's talk about what's going well for Suga and what's kind of not going so well for him. So, gosh, I want to like him and I want him to do well. But when you look at him recently, he just looks tired. He looks a little bit indecisive when he's, on TV. He's on TV a lot. When he announced the extension of the state of emergency and the inclusion of Aichi, Fukuoka, Hyogo, it really did look kind of bad for him. The fact that Mr. Abe kind of came out of the blue and launched this referendum law. So this is the first step in revising the Constitution. It's been a boogie bear within the Parliament. The opposition parties have not even gone to meetings where they're talking about it, but he was able to pull one last week. He got the Constitutional Democratic Party to agree to the revisions and accept some of the concessions, and then they allowed it to go through the lower house, and it will probably become law this month. So all of a sudden the gates are open and the referendum law will pass through. This is very swift, but it really angers a lot of people who are dedicated to preserving the peace constitution. Japan is unique in the world in that it has the peace not totally unique. I mean, they're Norway, Sweden, those countries have similar constitutions. But Japan is pretty unique given the geopolitics and the situational dynamics of Japan here in the Southeast Asia, to have that kind of constitution. And a lot of Japanese take great pride in it. On the other hand, there are some people that say, hell no. The Americans came in, they bossed us around, they wrote our constitution, they dominated us with the military, they own the airspace. We are our own sovereign nation. We should be able to defend ourselves. We should be able to project our own power. We should have a military. We shouldn't rely on the the United States, and it is, not inaccurate for people to say, when when the United States sneezes, Japan gets a cold. So there is a lot of influence there, but at the same time, there are benefits that go with that. I mean, Japan hasn't had to spend an enormous amount of its money on its defense-related budget. They try and keep it less than 6% of the GDP. Whereas if they were having to pay for it themselves, it would probably be more like 20%. But the United States backs that up, and they're under some sort of maybe a nuclear umbrella. They're under the umbrella of the United States in any event. In fact, the entire budget of the self-defense forces and military expenditures in Japan can be covered completely by the amount of taxes that are generated from the tobacco tax. So, other resources being devoted, or that could have been devoted, are now being devoted to, making Japan a strong economy, the automobile sector, different sectors that they've identified. So, there's good and bad there. But with regard to the Prime Minister, Mr. Abe coming up and, putting his shoulder around Mr. Suga and saying, you're doing a good job, it does have a little bit of a creepy feel to it. Maybe in isolation it doesn't, but in conjunction with other things that I'm going to be talking about, it kind of does. The second thing about Mr. Suga's predicament is that there were 3 by-elections, and the results came out last week. We talked a little bit about it, but the LDP did not win any of those, and they're bellwethers of what's going to happen in the next election. We've got elections coming up in September, most likely, for the members of the lower house. They have to all go for election because their term of office, their 4-year term of office, comes to a close. So how the Constitutional Democratic Party was able to finesse that is a signal of how they're going to play politics and election campaigning in the next one, too. So there's a lot going on there. Mr. Suga was not appointed as Prime Minister by popular vote, but through back office, alignment to fill in where Mr. Abe kind of suddenly stepped out. So he's not running the whole show all by himself. So all of these things kind of begin to collect on who is the best person to be Prime Minister in an election cycle. And more, it kind of doesn't look like it's Mr. Suga, with his vibrancy, with his leadership, with the things that are happening sometimes just by serendipity. You're lucky and you look like you're a winner. And that's not happening for him. The fact that he had to kind of tell the population, I promised you that I would get my handle on the vaccines and the COVID rollout. I have to extend the state of emergency. That's pretty much a black mark in his eye, and plus he had to throw in 2 other prefectures there. His indecision on the Olympics is really starting to be an irritation with not only Koike, but with the Olympic Committee as well. You'll see that there have been recent pronouncements just since the last time we talked that the International Olympic Committee has said the Olympics will go without fail. There's no way they won't happen. But, the Japanese are looking at each other. I think probably the Prime Minister wants to go forward because of the money and the contracts involved. And depending on who says ouch and cancels the Olympics, there is a penalty to be paid for that. So probably maybe by an act of God, the Japanese population just says, look, it's, we had Golden Week, we had a state of emergency, and there was a bloom, and we're going to have the foreigners come in. Let's not do that. It could be that kind of a pressure. Similarly, it could be various countries' Olympic teams saying, the team is prepared and available, but we just feel too much at risk with the country going through a kind of a spike in COVID infections, we think we're going to sit this one out. You have a couple of important countries do that, and pretty soon the IOC cancels. So who's going to pay the penalty there is an open guess. Who calls that shot? But that's going on in Mr. Suga's world, and it's a kind of a daily thing. We talked earlier about the 2 million vials of vaccine that were kind of found and discovered. They made a big brouhaha about that. That looks bad to Mr. Kono, and it looks bad to Mr. Suga too, and also that the rollout has been so slow. On the other hand, he had a relatively good visit with Joe Biden. They made some decisions on the environment, which is very pleasing to Koizumi Shinjiro, who is the oldest son of former Prime Minister Koizumi. And some new pronouncements of making Japan carbon neutral by 2050. The actual pronouncement was we will be we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 46% by 2030, which is just down the corner. I mean, that's 8 years away. So it gives Mr. Koizumi a platform and energy and money to make the kind of changes that Japanese society, trucking, energy consumption, nuclear power, all of these things. He will be in the news more and more actively in the next, assuming he survives the shift in government in September. With that kind of attention, he is picked to be a former or a future prime minister. That's likely to happen, but probably Kono Taro is way ahead of him in terms of his candidacy. So the other thing is with hydrogen generation and carbon neutrality. The Japanese are moving very briskly in that area. This is good news for industry and economy, new technologies, that sort of thing. At the same time, you have Mr. Abe, another kind of dark mark for the prime minister, announcing with Tomomi Inada, who is a protege of Mr. Abe's, number one on the revision of the Constitution, but also on nuclear power plants. She's from Fukui. There are 11 nuclear power plants in her prefecture, in her election district, and Mr. Abe is pushing for a restart and construction of new nuclear power plants. You might not know this, but Kono Taro is pretty vocally against nuclear power. Koizumi said we're going to achieve carbon neutrality with solar, and that's almost laughable because solar does not have that kind of capacity. Even solar combined with wind generation is not going to do the trick. They have to come up with something else, and they've identified hydrocarbon as the next new fuel. So there'll be a lot of technology going into that. It's expensive at the beginning, but I think that they will be successful. Japan has to be successful at that. Mr. Suga also announced a third supplemental budget, 50 billion Japanese yen. He's also announced a children's agency. We talked about this a little bit. It's now getting steam and will probably be a bill that's presented in 2022. Maybe not enough time to burnish the image of the LDP, but it is sponsored by Mr. Nikai, so definitely he doesn't need it because he'll be reelected as a member of the lower house when that time comes. But the fact that he's trying to promote to the Japanese population, we care, we're concerned, children, we like children and small furry animals too, so vote for us. That's going on, and Mr. Suga benefits from that. And the other thing that's come up, and I'll close it off with this, is legalized sports gambling. That came up 2 weeks ago as a kind of a trial balloon. Later this week, it came up for baseball and soccer. It is the tourism industry has suffered so greatly that the Japanese bureaucrats are scratching their heads, wondering where can we supplement the money that should have been there but is not. Tourism was a great boost because it's except for the infrastructure, it's free money. People come in, they leave their money, they don't tax the social services. They stay in hotels and eat in restaurants, and they buy trinkets, and then they go home and they leave their money here. So it's a great boost to the economy. They're looking for something to supplement that, and so this idea that has been so distasteful to the Japanese, except for this integrated resorts idea that has been on hold because of COVID. So this idea of gambling is becoming something more acceptable. This isn't a done deal. It's just in consideration right now, but it is indicative of where the country could possibly be going in the near term. They've said that for the world to get back on its feet, it's going to take about 10 years and 10 trillion US dollars to get back to where we would have been had it not been for COVID. So just to wrap up, this is my next to last point. You can anticipate that once the vaccine rolls out, and once, for example, herd immunity kicks in, or this is all behind us, we're not wearing masks, we're not social distancing, we're relaxed now. The fact that the Japanese economy is going to boom, and boom in a very big way, is a high likelihood. Something akin to the Roaring '20s in the United States before the big crash. So I think with the energy that's been pent up, you can anticipate, more children being born, more goods, a huge tourism uptick, and a lot of money being generated in the very near term. So that's my prognosis for that. With that, I'd like to close this point and get ready for my last point, which is a new feature on Clubhouse. But if there's any questions or comments, I'd like to entertain them now. Great. So if you remember from last week, I think it was Greg who said, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how Japanese politics works. How do things get done? How is influence applied? How are bills made, and why is that important to me? And how does it impact me as a businessman here, or somebody that lives in Japan, even though I don't have the right to vote? So those are great questions. And given that we have an election that's coming up within the next 3 months, I thought what I'd do is just take a little bit of time to explain the upper house and the lower house to everybody. And if this has interest to you, we can carve out a portion every week and talk about a different aspect of Japanese politics and how it moves and why it moves. And just as a kind of background, I think most people who know me know this about me, but when I finished law school in Sendai, I was hired by a member of the Japanese parliament, and I came into Tokyo as his aide. And it was the first time for a foreigner to work in the parliament. And so it was intensely interesting to me to have that insight and to be watching and being involved in Japanese politics beyond what even a normal Japanese kid would be like. I mean, this is such a rare opportunity. So I really delved into it and learned a lot and was exposed to far more than my age or my nationality would have deserved. But it was a great ride for me. The fellow who hired me was in the upper house and soon changed from the upper house to the lower house, ran an election that we have, not unlike the one that we have coming up in 3 months, and won his seat. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of winning by such a landslide, he became foreign minister. So it was a big deal for him. But these kinds of things happen, and they happen for a reason, and I'd like to explain a little bit of that to you. So first of all, the Diet, everybody calls it the Diet in English. It's actually a German word, the Diet. The Diet is a transplant from, in the Meiji period, they sent emissaries throughout the world to find out what was the best medicine, what was the best technology, what was the best machinery. Everybody knows that. But they also sent out government people to figure out what was the best form of government that we could perhaps apply to Japan. And they found one. It was called the Diet in Germany. It was for a district in Austria that had a bicameral legislature. One house, which was kind of the upper house, was appointed by the royal family. And the other house, the lower house, was representatives of the various districts. And so they liked that kind of combination, so they pulled it over. And that's why the parliament is called the Diet here. It's a German word that represents that kind of a system. And originally, the upper house was called the House of Peers, and you were appointed by the royal family. And the lower house, you had to own a certain piece of land, a certain amount of land. You had to be a male, and you could be elected from other males in your various districts. And that's how things were run. The House of Peers had an election cycle of they had a 6-year term, and the House of Representatives was a 4-year rolling term. So the House of Peers was supposed to be stable, kind of untouchable by politics. They had their 6-year term come hell or high water, and so it provided kind of a rudder for Japanese society. And the lower house, rough and tumble, dealing with new situations, new laws. Most of the laws are generated through the lower house. And bills that are created in one house pass through that house from a committee. They're presented by the committee. They go to the house votes on it, majority vote, and then it goes to the next house. So the originating house to the next house, and the upper house, in this case, would evaluate that and pass it or turn it down. If they don't vote on it, if it's the scenario where it starts in the lower house and goes to the upper house, it becomes law anyway, because the upper house has not taken its prerogative to vote on it. If the bill starts in the upper house, it happens, but it's kind of less likely because it's more of a relaxed atmosphere there. There's not so much pressure. 6 years is a long time. If you survive 6 years and do a relatively good job, you're probably going to get reelected. In the lower house, there are too many forces that are competing, and the door is wider open for people to submit their application to become a Diet member in a district. So there's higher competition there. The door of entry is much bigger than it is with the upper house. So currently, the prime minister has always come from the lower house, which is why the fellow who hired me decided to change from the upper house into the lower house. He wanted to become prime minister. He had already been in the upper house for 5 terms, so that's 30 years, and he wanted to stake his claim for prime minister. He didn't make it. They kind of said, look, we got other people that are in line. They're in line before you, so why don't you take foreign ministry, and let's leave it at that, which is what he did. So the upper house and the lower house has far many members than the upper house. The lower house has 465 members, and they rotate every 4 years, except there's only been 2 instances when they actually went their full 4 years. In most instances, the house is closed down. They go for an election because of a vote of no confidence, or because the prime minister doesn't like what's going on, or maybe he thinks the timing is right. His party will benefit as a result of an election. He takes the opposition parties by surprise, and he wins more. Edmund, welcome. Edmund, after you finish praying to Allah, can you put us on mute? Allah Akbar. Thank you. The lower house has 245 members. How people become an upper house member or a lower house member is different. Their election districts are different, and the kind of individuals that aspire or that can be elected are very different. So the lower house kind of sneers at the upper house as just a bunch of monkeys. They just don't do a very good job. They're not real professionals. They're movie stars. They're singers. They got elected because they wrote a book, that sort of thing. That's not completely accurate, but it is accurate in certain instances. Whereas in the lower house, it's rough and tumble. If you're not providing value to your constituents on a constant basis, your chances of being reelected are very low. And there is nothing more important, there is absolutely nothing more important for a member of the lower house than being reelected. So everything that they do is geared towards that. They must get reelection. Otherwise, their 4 years or their 3 years was a waste of their time. And what are they going to do now that they're out of office? They're not only out of office, they're out of a job. So who's going to hire them? What are they going to do? Are they going to become a lobbyist? It's just a fearful outcome. So there's a lot of energy there. In terms of the weight of the LDP in both houses, I think people know this because it's mentioned enough, but I just want to touch on it. That the LDP is in a coalition with Komeito. And it's in this coalition, it's been in this coalition for 20 years, because if they combine their votes, then they have a greater possibility of dictating what the parliament is going to do, what the bills are going to be, who gets the appointments, that sort of thing. In doing that, they always have to give one of the cabinet seats to a member of Komeito as a consequence of that. So Komeito adds a little bit of push. So, for example, let's go with the upper house first. The LDP has, of the 245, it has 142 members. Combined with the 28 members from Komeito, it has 61%. It has a majority. It doesn't have a super majority, but it has at least a majority. If it didn't have Komeito, it would have 57%, which is a majority, but 61% is better because it's closer to the two-thirds majority. And I'll talk about why the two-thirds majority is important after I talk about the lower house situation. So in the lower house, with the vastly more members, of the 465 members in the upper house, the LDP has 307 members. And with Komeito has 29 members. They have 72%. So that looks like a supermajority. If it wasn't for Komeito, they'd have 66%. The reason why these numbers are important, and I know it's kind of hard to remember, focus on them. The upper house, 61%, the LDP Komeito coalition, compared to 72% in the lower house. And the reason that this is important, incredibly important for former Prime Minister Abe, is because in order to pass a constitutional revision, you need to have a supermajority pass it in the lower house, a supermajority pass it in the upper house, and then it goes for a referendum where 51% of the people who vote have to vote for that referendum. So that's why Komeito is there. That's why the referendum bill was passed, or will be passed, before the end of this month, actually, so that we can begin going to that. We don't have the supermajority. Komeito and LDP don't have that supermajority to pass the bill now, but that is the direction, that is the drive. But it also inflects on how other diet politics are being run. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of insight there. I'd like to open the room. If it's too confusing, I apologize. We can maybe touch on it again, or maybe just through your questions. But I think it's important to touch on that with the election that's coming up. Thank you very much, and I hope it wasn't too thick. I'd like to open the room for questions. And with this, we can open the question to any of the issues that we talked about, or if you have a new issue you want to talk about. Thank you, everybody. Maya?
Yes. Okay. We've got Takeshi coming up, and I have a question to you, but I would like to hear Takeshi's question and your reply to his question first. Hello, Takeshi. Thank you very
Lightning
much.
bolts shooting
Yes.
from his eyes.
Hi, Timothy. Thank you.
How are you?
Good. How are you? Your first point, new ambassador to Japan. My simple question is is it good for Japan in terms of the geopolitical complexity we're facing with Japan? I mean, China and Korea and Taiwan. If you can share your view.
Yeah, I kind of think it is. He's close to Biden, and he will inform and counsel him based on what the situation is on the ground. I think he will be adequately assisted. You know, the U.S. Embassy, it's huge. It's one of the best posts for the Foreign Service in the world. It used to be Paris, or maybe Vienna, or sometimes even Moscow was a good post. But all the diplomats, all the State Department, they love being posted to Japan. It is a huge post. It's a huge benny for the ambassador. I'm sure he'll do a good job. But he is also, strongly I wouldn't say anti-Chinese, but he's a tough negotiator, and I think being here in Japan, he will cover that base pretty well. He's pretty tough. The thing I'm just reserved about is that it's a hard country to get to know, and you don't want the ambassador to be managed or manipulated by the host country so that he can get kudos and he can get a bit of bandwidth. The Japanese prefer somebody who really doesn't know that much, because they can leverage that. They can do favors, they can be friendly and tit for tat, and I'll do this for you and you do that for me. And that's much easier when somebody doesn't have a lot of the groundwork here. And the ambassador is a tough job, but mastering how Japanese society works and Japanese politics, it's also a PhD course. So I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. That's good news. Thank you.
Well, my question is, kind of touches upon Takeshi's question. And so in one of the previous rooms here, you talked about tensions building in the Asia-Pacific region, and that specialists in the field, think that there is a relatively high possibility of a military conflict in this region. And of course, we've got, the new American ambassador coming, who is known to have supported, American military operations in the Middle East before.
Right.
So, and of course, China continues to build its economic, also political and military power. So, how do you think, these three things will come together, and what are the possible implications in the future?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But the fact that the number 2 in the embassy will be Ray Green, who is at the American Institute in Taiwan, is a big signal. So if you look at what's going on in Hong Kong, it's not looking very good. The United States has not really weighed in heavily. It is Chinese territory, and they're making inroads there to quell freedom of speech and insisting, on their ways of how the territory should be run. I think the real, you just need to watch what's going on with Hong Kong and what's going on with Myanmar, what the United States posture is, and Taiwan. So I don't have the URL for it, but a former general wrote a piece just recently about what a potential conflict in Taiwan would look like. It's not nice. It's not an easy thing to look at. Maybe I should circulate the URL for that piece, but it talks about what the dynamics would be, what the likely outcome is going to be. But China has long said, Taiwan belongs to us. We are one country, and we will make that a reality in due course. I don't think it's going to happen this year or next year or probably in 3 years, but the buildup is worrisome, and the Chinese have not been historically known to be encroaching on other people's territories, but with the Belt and Road Initiative and with their aggression in building islands in the South Pacific and in the East Sea, it does. It's a troubling thing. Their growth of their military and particularly their naval forces is cause for great concern. So it's something that all of us need to watch, because if there is a conflict, definitely it will involve Japan. So we become not only a participant, but also a nice, easy target. And I think with the Japanese population, should that happen, all they need is like a slap or a show of, if any Japanese soldiers or self-defense forces died, that would be such a shock that the prime minister would be forced to either resign or change his ways with regard to a potential military conflict. I don't think they're emotionally prepared for that.
Thank you. So please, everybody who is in the listening in the room, please feel free to let us know if you would like to share an opinion, make a comment, talk with Timothy directly. So we'll let you up on stage.
Or we can close it up. It's 9 o'clock, so wow, what great timing.
Well, we've got yes, Fumi. Thank you very much for coming up. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Timothy. Thank you, Maya-san. I've been enjoying this room every Sundays.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I haven't watched TVs and news lately, so this is kind of the room that gives me kind of insights, updating what's going on in Japanese politics. But I'm not an expert of, I'm not following the Japanese politics too much, but I'm just, average Joe, average Tanaka-san in Japan. But I wanted to ask you guys about Article 7 of Japanese Constitution. So my dilemma is, when I vote, I tend to go LDP because I think they are the only one who can lead this country. We tried a Minshito, Hatoyama-san or Edano-san or Kan-san. That was, I think, a terrible era in the Japanese politics, I guess. We had a very bad economics, and also, the changing the military base from Okinawa to somewhere, and the Henoko problems, and we had the big earthquake, and Prime Minister Kan at the time was not doing very well either. So I think the LDP is kind of the only option I have at the moment. But the goal for the LDP, the objective, the reason why they built that party is to change the Japanese constitution, basically. And I think the Article 7 is super important for Japanese people and to protect peace. But so but I think I was raised in by my dad, who was born 1940. So he's a kind of the last generation who knows about the war. So when I was raised, he kept saying, no war, no war. This Article 7 is super important. This is like a beauty of the Constitution, da 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 da. But nowadays, I can see especially young people, among young people in the Yahoo News in the comments, and young people just stating a lot of like a lot of right wing comments, like about China, about Korea, and the young people are kind of very very aggressive. So if we sort of delete this, change this constitution, number 7, like abandonment of the war, or maybe giving up the military power, etc. I think in 50 years' time we are going to do the war again, maybe because the chain. I'm worrying about the chain of the violence. Basically, if the Senkaku, around Senkaku or maybe Takeshima, if something happens, someone shoots somebody, and then people getting aggressive, and then maybe we start a war again. So that's something I'm worrying about. However, I've got a dilemma. I think the SDP is quite good for the economy-wise, or maybe Kodomocho, etc. But this is can you see the dilemma? So I'm asking, is it achievable to state self-force defense and also this giving up the war thing or military power, both sort of stating in the Constitution? Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible, and depending on who you talk to, people would say it's inevitable. People who have not experienced what the Japanese experienced might forget what it was like. But at the same time, the Japanese haven't been very good at cleaning up from that and building better relations with their Southeast Asian neighbors, China being one in particular. So there's a lot of legacy issues. But for young people, it is a great question to ask. Why don't we have our own military? Why are we relying on those Americans? And I heard this story and this rumor about the Americans and they're doing this and that. So that really has great appeal. It's not a conspiracy. I mean, some of it is actually true. And so the younger generation, especially those young men who feel some form of patriotism, the outlets for them to express that, there's not universal conscription here. And even joining the self-defense forces is not the primary selection set for most Japanese. So being a pundit about that and wanting a strong Japan and a Japan that doesn't have to kowtow to anybody, I think that's an aspiration for any person who is who loves their country and wants to be independent. And then on the other side, the peace constitution, it is absolutely, as your dad said, it is a beautiful thing. The Americans did a great job, and I think that they really had a lot of brotherly love for the Japanese and helped them, unlike any nation has done to a defeated enemy in human history. It's just amazing what happened. But changing the constitution, it is the drive of the prime minister. I think it's not a negative thing. It's something that Japanese people have to decide on their own. But from time to time, the United States is not a totally reliable party either. So there's always that. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy-san. Yeah, it's okay. Maybe as a Japanese person, I will think about this issue.
Thank you.
Like deeply, profoundly, and I'll vote. I'll choose the party. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Timothy. Hiya, everyone. How you going?
Hello.
Sounds like you're in a cave.
I'm walking through an underpass and the train's going over, so sorry about that. But just further to that question, I read recently that the Japanese Navy is bigger than the British Navy at the moment. That's one point. And the other is feedback from people who know the Defense Force, primarily Americans who are in the military who've met and worked with them. it's a very domestic, like a domestic company. It's run in a very hierarchical, as it should, but in a very Japanese way. So those two things together, do you think they're really capable of fielding a real Army, Navy, Air Force? Should that constitution be changed, and should threats rise with China or anyone else?
Yeah, I think any comments that I might have would be negatively interpreted, so I should not say one way or the other. But yeah, if they go that direction, they have to. Yeah, it needs to be populated by people who are patriotic about their country, and it requires a lot more people than they have right now. So it's a great observation.
Yeah, I had no idea they had such a large navy. But on the other hand, you look at the very domestic way politics is run in this country, and imagine that flowing through a modern defence force. One has to wonder, at least.
Well, the Japanese Navy was the most feared Navy at one point. It even defeated the Soviet Navy. And during the Pacific War, it was, more than even the fighter pilots. Being in the Japanese Navy was a huge point of pride, and even today, the legacy and the sense of devotion to, the Navy is so strong. I mean, it's just one of the. I mean, if you're going to go into the SDF and you belong to the Navy, that's the highest, I think, aspiration one could have. So yeah, there's a lot of money is being put into the Navy. It's funny. It is an island country. You would think that they would be good at it, and you'd also think that there would be much more of an affinity of the Japanese people to the sea with sports and leisure activities, but it's not. So there's a lot of things that are funny about Japan that you would think one thing, but actually the opposite is true. But it's a country that's full of these kind of dichotomies that just have you scratching your head, and it's just a really interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jason.
So, Timothy, I have one more question, if that is okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So, what is the latest on the Tokyo Olympics? It seems becoming more like a game of a chicken. Whoever initiates the process need to pay, right? So.
Yeah, there has been, Maya follows this pretty closely too. She might have some insight on it. The stuff that's going on with the Tokyo governor and the national government, under Mr. Suga, and the International Olympic Committee. It is just, it's not a cat fight, but it is like a game of chicken. I think more than 80% of the Japanese population doesn't want the Olympics. They're afraid of a super bloom. They already acknowledge that too much money has been spent on it, and that taxpayers are going to be saddled with this. So let's cut our losses. So there are a lot of competing forces. The television rights, the international viewership. I think for kicking Japan off as a country, as a destination for tourism after the Olympics, after COVID, I think it's a good thing. And I think either way they do it, it will be a dynamic event. But I think the closer we get to it, the more the game of chicken comes out. Maya, do you have anything to add?
Well, that's you summed it very well, I think. But yes, indeed, there is a lot of tension between the governor of Tokyo, Ms. Koike, and the prime minister. So at the moment, we don't know what happens, but I think that, Timothy mentioned in one of the previous rooms that it's nowadays it's more like mitigating the losses, or just trying to decrease the losses, because if the Olympics are held, there will be losses, financial and so on, but there will be anyway. There will be fewer losses, if when compared to the Olympics which are not held. And at the same time, it's just as Timothy mentioned, now it's legacy. So and tourism, it's a very important. The Olympics are very important legacy for the travel and tourism industry, and it is a huge industry. And I mean, it has grown up in a tremendous way over the past 7 or 8 years, especially here in Japan, but also all over the world. And we don't know what happens. Just the other day, there was an article in BBC, by BBC, and that article was actually giving details about who is responsible for canceling the Olympics. And the point there was that, of course, there are a lot of issues which concern insurance, and also of course, financial losses, health issues, and so on. But at the end of the day, that article, in the article, it was mentioned that the International Olympic Committee is the one which has to, and has the the authority to cancel the Olympics. And then they also, in the article, it was mentioned that if the majority of the major countries participating in the Olympics, if they pull their teams out, then probably it will speak to the International Olympic Committee, and then they will decide to cancel the games. But that's really, it's so much politics there too. And of course, we all know that there is a lot at stake there for the committee too, the International Olympic Committee there too. So yes, Takeshi, as you say, it's really a complicated question, and the only thing for us to do at the moment is to wait and see.
Yeah, it's a little bit upsetting. It's a little less than 100 days. I have some tickets, so I'm always joking. Maybe still Olympic is happening, but no audience, maybe no athletes.
Right.
That's my observation, that everybody talks about who is supposed to cancel, mostly blaming Japanese government, but nobody talks about the not just the athletes, but the rest of the teams. It's like somewhere between 3 and 8 people for every athlete that normally come.
That's right.
Nobody talks about them. They're simply not going to come enough to make it even viable for most sports. Possibly some sports are extra committed. So that's not going to happen. But I hadn't thought about the whole who's to blame thing. Maybe countries are also financially impacted if they cancel, and so they're not going to say anything. And so there's this three-way or multiple-way game of chicken going on, because no one wants to take the heaviest brunt of the financial losses. It's crazy.
Yeah.
They'll have to rethink that after this, the way they've set it up legally.
Well, I think this time next week there's going to be some movement, and I think there'll be something for us to talk about. As Takeshi said, we've got less than 100 days. A lot can happen, and if it's going to happen negatively, the sooner the better. So let's wait and see. But please stay tuned for the analysis for next week.
Well, any other questions or comments, opinions?
Emmy. Did she get elevated?
No, I didn't get the no. I
Anyway,
don't think so. Okay.
there's a lot of really distinguished people in the audience. Ted, how are you? It's been such a long time since I've seen you in Tokyo, but thank you for joining the room, and I hope it's been insightful for you. You're doing really important work, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in Israel. Yasuhide Nakayama made a statement that generated a lot of concern. Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in.
Well, with this then, I think that we can proceed with closing the room.
Terrific. I can go about my day.
Right. So,
Did you want to say something, Takeshi? I'm sorry.
And I said that. Thank you. It's really,
Okay,
really
great,
insightful as
great.
always.
well, I would like to say that, well, as you have noticed, this conversation has been recorded and it will be uploaded on the Japan Expert Insights, the website, during the next week. So if you have missed some parts of it, or if you would like to hear some of the parts again, you're welcome to go to the website and listen to the conversation. So the URL of the website is on my profile. And also, you can always, do a search, Google search with Japan Expert Insights. So, and it will come up. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for doing that, Maya. That's great. Also, let me give just a plug. If you're interested in Japanese politics, we produce a newsletter. It can be found on my company webpage, LangleyEsquire.com. We produce maybe 2 newsletters a month. Some of them are broad, like this Clubhouse, goes into a lot more detail and more facts and figures that is easier to absorb when you read a document rather than listening to me babble about it. But you can sign on for the newsletter as well. And I just really appreciate everybody listening on Clubhouse. It's been really insightful for me too.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to close the room in about a minute. So everybody who is in the audience, if you would like to check the profiles of the people around you and follow some of them, or everybody, please do it now. Thank you again, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time. And also, if you would like to hear about the specific topic next time, or the week after that, please let us know by email. So you can always email me or Timothy, or connect with us on LinkedIn, even on the messenger, so we can prepare and give you the information which you would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks for moderating.
Thank you. Okay, so see you next time then, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.